Most days, Ethan Miller's penthouse apartment felt more like a museum than a home pristine, cold, and untouched by life. His 9-year-old son Owen hadn't moved or spoken in years. The doctors had given up. Hope had faded. But everything changed one quiet morning when Ethan came home early and saw the impossible, his cleaner Sophia dancing with Owen, and for the first time his son was watching. What began as a simple gesture became the spark that unwound years of silence, pain, and buried truths. Stay with us to witness a story of quiet miracles, profound loss, and the power of human connection. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine, it comes from movement. The morning had unfolded with mechanical precision like any other in the Miller penthouse. Staff arrived at scheduled hours. Their greetings were brief and necessary, their movements calculated and silent. Ethan Miller, founder and CEO of Synapse Tech, had left for a board meeting shortly after 7 a.m., pausing only to check the untouched breakfast tray outside Owen's room. The boy hadn't eaten again. He never did. Owen Miller, 9 years old, hadn't spoken in almost 3 years. A spinal injury caused by the accident that took his mother had left him paralyzed from the waist down. But what truly haunted Ethan wasn't the silence or the wheelchair, it was the absence behind his son's eyes. No pain. No anger, just a void. Ethan had poured millions into therapy, experimental neuro programs, and virtual simulations. None of it mattered. Owen sat every day in the same spot by the same window, under the same light, immobile, unblinking, untouched by the world. The therapist said he was shut down. Ethan preferred to think Owen was locked in a room he refused to leave. A room Ethan couldn't enter, not with science, not with love, not with anything. That morning, Ethan's board meeting was cut short by a sudden cancellation. An international partner had missed his flight. With 2 unexpected hours free, he decided to return home, not out of sentiment or worry, but out of habit. There was always something to review, something to fix. The elevator ride was swift, and as the doors to the top-floor penthouse opened, Ethan stepped out with the usual mental checklist of logistics running behind his eyes. He wasn't prepared for the music. It was faint, almost elusive, and not the kind that played through the penthouse's integrated system. It had a real, imperfect living texture. He paused, unsure. Then he moved down the hall, each step slow, almost involuntary. The music grew clearer, a delicate yet steady waltz. Then came something even more unthinkable, the sound of movement. Not the robotic whir of a vacuum or the clatter of cleaning tools, but something fluid like a dance. And then he saw her. Sophia. She was turning slowly, gracefully barefoot on the marble floor. The sun streamed through the open blinds, casting soft stripes across the living area, as if trying to dance along with her. In her right hand, held carefully, as if it were a porcelain artifact, was Owen's. His small fingers were loosely laced with hers, and she gently spun, guiding his arm through a simple arc as if he were leading her. Sophia's movements weren't grand or rehearsed. They were quiet, intuitive, personal. But what stopped Ethan wasn't Sophia. It wasn't even the dance. It was Owen, his son, his broken, unreachable boy. Owen's head was tilted slightly upward. His pale blue eyes were locked onto Sophia's figure, following her every move, unblinking, unswerving, focused, present. Ethan's breath caught in his throat and his vision blurred, but he didn't look away. Owen hadn't made eye contact with anyone in over a year, not even during his most intensive therapies. And yet there he was, not just present, but subtly participating in a dance with a near stranger. Ethan stood there longer than he realized until the music faded, and Sophia gently turned to face him. She didn't seem surprised to see him. If anything, her expression was serene, as if she had expected this moment. She didn't release Owen's hand immediately. Instead, she slowly stepped back, allowing Owen's arm to gently fall to his side as if pulling him out of a dream. Owen didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. His gaze drifted to the floor, but not in that empty, dissociated way Ethan was used to. It felt natural, like a child who had simply played a little too hard. Sophia offered a simple nod toward Ethan, not of apology or guilt, just a gesture like one adult acknowledging another across a line that hadn't yet been drawn. Ethan tried to speak, but nothing came out. His mouth opened, his throat tightened, but the words betrayed him. Sophia turned and began gathering her cleaning cloths, humming softly under her breath as if the dance had never happened. It took Ethan several minutes to move. He stood there like a man shaken by an earthquake he hadn't seen coming. His mind tumbled in a cascade of thoughts. Was this a violation? An advancement? Sophia was no therapist. Who gave her permission to touch his son? And yet none of those questions held real weight compared to what he had seen in that moment. Owen's tracking his response. His connection was real, undeniable, more real than any report, MRI, or prognosis he had ever read. He walked slowly toward Owen's wheelchair, almost expecting the boy to revert to his usual state. But Owen didn't pull back. He didn't move either, but he wasn't turned off. His fingers curved slightly inward. Ethan noted the slightest tension in his arm, as if the muscle had remembered it existed. And then the faintest whisper of music returned, not from Sophia's device, but from Owen himself. A barely audible hum, faint, but a melody. Ethan stumbled back a step. His son was humming. He didn't say a word for the rest of the day, not to Sophia, not to Owen, not to the silent staff who noticed something had shifted. He locked himself in his office for hours, watching the security footage from earlier, needing to confirm it hadn't been a hallucination. The image was seared into him, Sophia twirling, Owen watching. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel joyful. What he felt was unknown to him. A disruption in the stillness his reality had become. Something in the space between loss and longing. A glimmer, perhaps. Hope. No, not yet. Hope was dangerous, but undeniably something had been broken. A silence broken not with noise, but with movement, something alive. That night, Ethan didn't pour his usual drink. He didn't answer emails. He sat alone in the dark, listening not to music, but to the absence of it, replaying in his mind the one thing he never thought he'd see again, his son in motion. The next morning would demand questions, repercussions, explanations. But none of that mattered in the moment it all began. A return home that wasn't meant to be a song, not meant to be played, a dance unfit for paralyzed children. Yet it happened. Ethan walked into his living room expecting silence and found a waltz instead. Sophia, the cleaner he had barely noticed until then, held Owen's hand in mid-turn. And Owen, unblinking, silent, unreachable, was watching. Not the window, not the void. He was watching her. Ethan didn't call Sophia in immediately. He waited until the staff dispersed and the house returned to its programmed order. But when he summoned her to his office that afternoon, the way he looked at her wasn't with rage, not yet, but with something colder, control. Sophia walked in without hesitation, her chin slightly raised, not defiant, but prepared. She had expected this. Ethan sat behind a sleek walnut desk, hands tented together. He gestured for her to sit. She declined. "Explain what you were doing," he said, his voice low and clipped. No wasted syllables. Sophia clasped her hands in front of her apron and met his eyes. "I was dancing," she said simply. Ethan's jaw tightened. "With my son." Sophia nodded. "Yes." The silence that followed was sharp. Why, he finally asked, almost spitting the word out. Sophia didn't flinch. "Because I saw something in him, a flicker. I played a song, his fingers twitched, he followed the rhythm, and I moved with him." Ethan rose. "You are not a therapist, Sophia. You are not trained. Do not touch my son." Her response was immediate, firm, but never disrespectful. No one else touches him either, not with joy or with confidence. "I didn't force him. I followed him." Ethan paced. There was something about her calm that made him more nervous than defiance. "You could have undone months of therapy." "Years," she murmured. "There is protocol structure." Sophia said nothing. He turned to her, raising his voice. "Do you know how much I pay for his care, what his specialists say?" Sophia finally spoke again, slower this time. "Yes. And they still don't see what I saw today." He chose to follow with his eyes, with his spirit, not because he was told to, but because he wanted to. Ethan felt his defenses crack, not out of agreement, but confusion. No part of this followed any formula he knew. "Do you think a smile is enough?" That music and spinning fixes trauma, Sophia didn't answer. She knew it wasn't her place to argue the point, and she also knew trying would miss the truth. Instead, she said, "I danced because I wanted to make him smile because no one else had." The statement was stronger than she perhaps intended. Ethan's fists clenched. His throat was dry. "You crossed a line." She nodded once. Maybe. But he was alive, Mr. Miller, if only for a minute. The words hung between them, raw, indisputable. He was close to firing her. Then he felt the impulse in his bones, the need to restore order control, the illusion that the systems he built protected the people he loved. But something about Sophia's last sentence stuck. He was alive. Ethan didn't say a word as he sat back down, dismissing her with a small wave of his hand. Sophia gave one last nod and left. Alone again, Ethan stared out the window. His reflection stared back in the glass. He didn't feel victorious. If anything, he felt disarmed. He had expected to crush whatever strange influence Sophia had ignited. Instead, he found himself staring into an empty space where certainty used to live. Her words resonated not with rebellion or sentiment, but with truth. And the most maddening thing of all was the fact that she hadn't begged to stay. She hadn't pleaded her case. She had simply told him what she saw in Owen, something he hadn't seen in years. It was as if she had spoken directly to the wound that still bled beneath all the layers of efficiency and logic. That night, Ethan poured a glass of whiskey but didn't drink it. He sat on the edge of his bed staring at the floor. The music Sophia had played, he hadn't even recognized the song, but the rhythm stayed with him. A soft, familiar pattern like breathing, if breathing could be choreographed. He tried to remember the last time he had heard music in that house that wasn't tied to a therapist's recommendation or some attempt at stimulation. And then he remembered her. Lillian, his wife. She had loved to dance, not professionally, but freely barefoot in the kitchen, holding a barely walking Owen humming melodies only she knew. Ethan had danced with her once in the living room right after Owen took his first steps. It had felt ridiculous and light all at once. That was before the accident, before the wheelchairs and the silence. He hadn't danced since. He hadn't allowed himself to. But that night in the quiet of his room, he found himself swaying slightly in his chair, not quite dancing, not quite still. Unable to resist the pull of that memory, Ethan got up and walked to Owen's room. He opened the door softly, almost afraid of what he might or might not see. Owen sat in his wheelchair with his back to the door, looking out the window as usual, but there was something different in the air, a faint sound. Ethan moved closer. It wasn't a device or a speaker. It was coming from Owen. His lips were barely parted. The sound was ragged, almost silent, but unmistakable. A humming, the same melody Sophia had played off-key, shaky, imperfect. Ethan's chest tightened. He stood there, afraid to move, afraid that whatever fragile miracle was unfolding would stop if he got too close. Owen didn't turn to look at him. He simply kept humming, swaying ever so slightly, a movement so subtle Ethan might have missed it if he hadn't been looking for signs of life. And then he realized that he always was. He just stopped expecting to find them. Back in his room, Ethan didn't sleep, not from insomnia or stress, but from something stranger, the weight of possibility. There was something about Sophia that unsettled him, and not because she overstepped. It was because she had made something impossible happen, something the most credentialed, expensive, and recommended professionals had not. She had reached Owen not with technique, but with something far more dangerous, emotion vulnerability. She had dared to treat his son like a child, not a case. Ethan had spent years trying to rebuild what the accident broke, with money, with systems, with technology. But what Sophia had done couldn't be replicated in a lab or measured on charts. That terrified him, and it also, though he still refused to name it, gave him something else, something he had buried under grief and protocol hope. And that hope, however small, rewrote everything. Sophia was allowed back into the penthouse under strict conditions, cleaning only. Ethan made this point clear the moment she walked in. No music, no dancing, just cleaning, he had said without making eye contact, in a deliberately neutral voice. Sophia didn't argue. She nodded once, took her mop and broom as if accepting the rules of a quiet duel, and moved with the same deliberate grace she always showed. There were no sermons, no lingering tension, just the faint unspoken knowledge between them that something sacred had happened and that it would now be treated as fragile. Ethan told himself this was caution, that any repetition of what occurred might disrupt whatever spark had been stirred within Owen. But deep down he knew he was protecting something else entirely himself. He wasn't prepared to admit her presence had reached a corner of his world untouched by science or structure. He watched her now from the hallway through a crack in an open door. Sophia didn't speak to Owen. She didn't even acknowledge him directly. She hummed as she went, interpreting soft melodies in a language Ethan couldn't identify. They weren't nursery rhymes or classical pieces. They were old-rooted, like something passed down from memory, not sheet music. At first, Owen remained as still as ever. His chair was positioned by the same window, and his face betrayed none of the emotions Ethan was desperate to see. But Sophia didn't expect miracles. She conducted her cleaning with a gentle rhythm, not choreographed but intentional. Her movements were fluid, as if she were within a current, not performing but existing. Occasionally she would pause mid-sweep and slightly alter her humming, letting the melody dip or vibrate. Ethan couldn't explain it, but it affected the air between them, even from the hall. Then one afternoon something small happened, something anyone else might have missed. Sophia swept quickly past Owen, and her melody dropped to a brief minor note. His eyes tracked her for just a second, but Ethan saw it. Sophia didn't react. She didn't speak or make a fuss. She continued humming without pause, as if she hadn't noticed. The next day, the same thing happened. This time, as she passed, his eyes moved to her and stayed there for a second longer. A few days later, he blinked twice as she turned away. Not rapid blinks, but intentional ones. It was almost like a conversation built without words, as if he were learning to respond in the only way he could. Ethan kept watching morning after morning. He remained out of sight behind the wall, his arms crossed and immobile. He told himself it was research observation, what he needed to know to ascertain if these responses were real or just coincidence. But with time he realized something was shifting, not just in Owen but in him. He no longer waited for Sophia to fail. He waited for her not to stop. She never imposed, never coaxed or cajoled. She simply offered presence, a consistent rhythm Owen could tap into whenever he wished. Sophia had no agenda, no clipboard, no timeline, just that same quiet steadiness. Sometimes she'd leave a colored dusting cloth on the table, and Owen would glance toward it. Once she paused while sweeping to gently tap a wooden spoon against a bucket. The rhythm was soft, almost a whisper, but Ethan saw Owen's foot move just once, barely noticeable, and then settle still. They weren't breakthroughs, not by traditional standards, but they were something more. Evidence that connection wasn't a switch to flip, but a ground to tend. Ethan found himself staying longer behind the hallway wall each day. His breathing slowed to match Sophia's rhythm. He tried once to explain it to Owen's physical therapist, but the words died in his mouth. How could he explain the feeling of watching a cleaner become a guide? How to describe eye twitches and finger flexes as milestones? They would call it anecdotal, rogue, unverifiable. Ethan didn't care. He had learned not to underestimate that which seemed like nothing. Sophia treated those moments like seeds, not with urgency, but with the confidence that something invisible was working beneath the surface. There was no ceremony or announcement. Sophia left at the end of her shift, tools in hand. She'd nod to Ethan if their paths crossed and disappear down the elevator, as if she hadn't altered the meaning of the day. It was maddening in a way, the humility with which she wielded power. Ethan couldn't tell if he was grateful or terrified of how much he needed her. He wondered where she had learned those lullabies, who had hummed them to her, but he never asked. It felt wrong to reduce her role to something explainable. What mattered was that when she was in the room, Owen was too, even if it was just a little bit more than the day before. On the 6th day, Sophia finished her sweeping and tidying without fanfare. Owen had tracked her movements 3 distinct times that morning. Once Ethan swore he saw the boy smile, just a twitch of the cheek, but it was there. Sophia noticed too, but didn't comment. That was her gift. She let the moments live and die without dressing them up. As she gathered her supplies to leave, she walked to the side table and paused. She pulled a napkin from her pocket, folded neatly. Without a word, she placed it on the table near Ethan's usual reading chair and glanced once toward the hallway. She knew he was watching. And then she was gone. Ethan waited until she was gone before approaching. The napkin was white, the kind kept in bulk, but there was a drawing on it, childlike yet precise pencil marks, 2 stick figures, one tall, one small. Their arms were outstretched, slightly curved unmistakably in mid-twirl. One figure had thick lines for hair. The other had a simple circle for a head. Ethan's throat tightened. He sat and held the napkin for a long moment. He didn't need to ask who had drawn it. The lines were wavering and uneven. There were smudges where the pencil had been erased and redrawn. But it was Owen, his son, who hadn't drawn anything in 3 years, who hadn't initiated communication, let alone captured a memory. Ethan stared at it. The simplicity was more piercing than any photograph. He could see it clearly now. In the moment Sophia spun him, Owen's hand was in hers. That was what Owen had chosen to remember. That was what he had chosen to keep. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a cry for help. It was an offering, a crumb of joy left by a child who had once retreated into silence. Ethan didn't frame the drawing. He didn't call anyone. He placed it carefully on the table and sat in silence next to it, letting the image say what his son couldn't. That evening, as the sun began to set and the shadows grew long on the penthouse floor, the napkin remained right where Sophia had left it. Proof that something inside Owen was slowly learning to move again. The therapy session began like any other, with structure, silence, and polite distance. Owen sat in his wheelchair, facing a speech therapist who had visited the penthouse twice a week for over a year. She was competent, kind, and ultimately ineffective. She spoke in soft, encouraging tones, used visual aids, repeated affirmations, and waited patiently for answers that rarely came. Ethan stood on the other side of the glass partition, arms crossed, watching without much hope. He had seen this play out too many times to expect anything new. The nurse, a kind woman named Carla, who had been with them since the accident, sat nearby, taking notes and occasionally glancing at the boy as if willing him to respond with her mere presence. Then the elevator chimed and Sophia entered unnoticed at first. She walked in with silent steps, holding a folded scarf in her hands, soft, colorful, worn in a way that suggested it had meaning. She didn't speak right away. She simply stood at the room's threshold, waiting until the therapist noted her. There was a moment of hesitation but no protest. Sophia gave Carla a small nod, then stepped forward. Ethan leaned closer to the glass as Sophia approached Owen. She didn't kneel. She didn't touch him. She simply held the scarf up, letting it hang and sway slightly like a pendulum. Her voice was soft, just loud enough to be heard. "Do you want to try again?" she asked, tilting her head. It wasn't persuasion. It wasn't a command. It was an open, pressure-free invitation. The room held its breath. The therapist turned, slightly unsure whether to intervene. Carla froze her eyes, darting from Sophia to Ethan, unsure where this fit into the boundaries of her role. But Owen blinked once, then another. 2 slow, deliberate blinks, his version of yes. The therapist gasped silently. Ethan's hand dropped from his mouth. The sound he made was halfway between a laugh and a sob. He turned away from the window, suddenly unable to bear being seen with his throat closed up. It wasn't just the response, it was the recognition. Owen had understood the question he had answered. Sophia didn't clap or react. She simply smiled, not at Owen, but with him, and began slowly wrapping the scarf around her fingers. She made a gentle game of loosely winding and then unwinding the scarf, letting the ends undulate in the air. Each time she let the scarf brush Owen's fingertips, she lingered to see if he reached. After a few passes, his hand moved not reflexively, but by choice. He didn't grab the scarf, but he acknowledged it. Sophia was never in a rush. She let him set the pace. The therapist, now speechless, slowly backed up to observe. It was clear the session had changed hands. Sophia wasn't running a therapy routine. She was following a language only she and the boy seemed to speak. Every moment was earned not by expertise, but by intuition and trust. Ethan remained behind the glass, his body rigid, but his face was different, vulnerable. For years he had paid people to unlock his son to breach the barrier of stillness. And there was Sophia, no title, no credentials, holding a scarf and pulling a yes from the boy everyone else had given up on. It wasn't dramatic, but it was revolutionary. A quiet revolution unfolding blink by blink. When the session concluded, Sophia returned the scarf to her bag without fanfare. She didn't make eye contact with Ethan on her way out. He didn't follow her. He couldn't. His emotions hadn't caught up to the moment. For a man who made decisions for empires, he felt powerless in the face of what he had just witnessed. Back in her cleaning corner, Sophia continued her usual tasks, wiping surfaces, straightening frames, and gathering linens. It was as if the miracle that had just occurred was as natural to her as breathing. And perhaps for her it was. That evening, long after the staff had retreated and the lights had dimmed in the penthouse, Sophia returned to her cart. Tucked between a spray bottle and a folded rag, she found a simple typed note. No envelope, just a small folded square. She carefully unfolded it. 4 words, thank you. E.M. Sophia read it twice, then once more. There was no signature beyond the initials, no instructions, no warnings, just gratitude, fragile and honest. She folded it and slipped it into her pocket without a word. But not everyone was pleased. The next day, as Sophia gathered supplies in the utility room, Carla approached her with a kind yet firm look. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said quietly, folding towels as she spoke. Sophia didn't answer right away. Carla continued, "He's starting to wake up and that's beautiful, but this family has been quietly bleeding for years. You stir too much up. They'll blame you for the pain that comes with the healing." Sophia turned, still calm, still serene. "I know what I'm doing," she said. "I'm not trying to fix him. I'm just giving him space to feel." Carla hesitated. "Be careful," she said. "You're healing things you didn't break." There was no malice in her voice, only concern, empathy. She didn't say it to discourage. She said it as someone who had watched the Millers fall apart piece by piece. Sophia placed a soft hand on Carla's arm. "Manos," she whispered. "That's exactly why I'm here." Her eyes held no doubt. Later that night, Sophia was alone in the cleaning closet holding the scarf in her hands. It was the same scarf she had brought from home, her mother's. It smelled faintly of bay leaf and thyme. She didn't need it for the job, but she kept it close now, not for show, not for naught, but as a reminder that softness could still break through stone, that sometimes what the world called incompetent was exactly what a broken soul needed. She had seen the blink. She had seen the spark. And even though Ethan had said nothing more than those 4 words, she felt his walls shift just enough to let the light in. The next morning, she returned to the penthouse early, humming again, a little louder. This time, no one stopped her. The glass door where Ethan had stood was no longer closed. It happened so fast, and yet it landed like a moment suspended in time. Sophia was kneeling next to Owen's chair, adjusting a ribbon they had been using for a coordination exercise. Ethan was watching from the doorway, arms crossed as usual, not out of coldness, but a habitual attempt to control any emotion stirring beneath the surface. The session had been gentle. Sophia let Owen set the pace. As always, Owen's hand movements had improved, a little more fluid, a little surer. She never rushed him, never asked him to do more than he could. Then, just as she gathered the ribbon into her hand, Owen opened his mouth. Air moved. It wasn't the kind of opening that signifies a yawn or a cough. His lips parted with intention, and out came a word, rough cracked, barely formed: Sophia. At first, Sophia thought she'd imagined it, but as she looked up, his lips moved again, softer now, barely audible. Sophia. 2 syllables, the first name he had spoken in 3 years. Not a sound, not a mumble. A name. Her name. Sophia held her breath. Her body trembled. She unknowingly dropped the ribbon. Ethan stumbled backward, hitting his shoulder against the doorframe. He hadn't expected any sound, not today, not ever, to be honest. The word resonated inside him more loudly than any he had heard in years. His son, his unreachable son, had spoken. But not Dad. Not yes. Not even Mom. He said Sophia. Ethan's reaction was immediate. He rushed forward, eyes wide, and dropped to his knees beside the wheelchair, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gasped, "Say it again. Say Dad. Can you say Dad?" He cupped the boy's cheeks, tried to catch his gaze, but Owen's eyes drifted away, not with indifference but almost with resistance. A slight shiver, a return to calm. Ethan pressed again, his voice cracking. "Please, son, try. Try for me." But the light that had been in Owen's eyes when he said Sophia's name was already dimming. He looked back at Sophia, then down, and his body retreated into the familiar armor of stillness. Ethan felt in his chest the way the moment had opened, and then receded like a tide too eager to reach the shore. He had asked too much too fast. Sophia placed a hand gently on Ethan's arm, not to scold, but to anchor him. She spoke softly in a voice firm but raw with understanding. "You try to fix it," she said, her eyes locked on Owen. "He just needs you to feel it." Ethan blinked, startled by the clarity of her words. He looked up at her, searching for judgment, but found none, only comprehension. She didn't say it with pity. It was an invitation, perhaps even a plea, to stop solving and start observing. He opened his mouth and closed it, his fingers still resting lightly on Owen's hand. Sophia turned her gaze back to the boy, whose sight had returned to the floor, but his fingers were trembling, a small sign he hadn't fully shut down. "You gave him a reason to speak," Ethan whispered. "I didn't." Sophia looked back at him, her expression unreadable. "He spoke because he felt safe," she said. "Not because he was told safe." Ethan nodded slowly, but it wasn't acceptance yet. It was the beginning of understanding, a far more uncomfortable place than ignorance. His voice was low. "But why you?" She paused. "Because I didn't need him to prove anything." He spent the rest of the day in near total silence. Sophia returned to her duties as if nothing had happened, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured mop water into the bucket. Ethan remained in Owen's room longer than usual, sitting beside him. No questions, no directions, just being there for once. Presence, without pressure. Carla checked in once, eyes wide at Sophia, and said nothing. No one knew what to do with the moment. There was no protocol for it. But something had shifted. The silence that used to fill the penthouse like a fog now held tension, not fear, but anticipation, like something about to happen. Sophia didn't mention the word Owen had said. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't feel it was hers to share. She felt it was sacred. But that night, after the staff left and the lights dimmed, Ethan stood alone in the hallway before silently entering his bedroom. He stopped in front of a tall dresser, his hands on the pull of the top drawer, breathing slowly. He opened the drawer and took out a photograph, one he hadn't touched in years. It was slightly warped at the edges, faded just enough to soften the image. Ethan and Lillian dancing her hair up his tie loose. She was laughing. He remembered the moment they danced in the living room the night they knew Owen was coming. A private celebration full of laughter, fear, and dreams they didn't yet understand. He turned the photo over, and there in her handwriting, a little smudged but still clear. "Teach him to dance even when I am gone." Ethan sat on the bed. The photo shook in his hands. He had forgotten those words, not because they weren't powerful, but because they were too painful. He had spent years trying to rebuild Owen's body, trying to fix what the accident broke, but he never once tried to teach him to dance. He didn't believe it was possible until now, until her, until Sophia. He hadn't said a name, not just any name, Sophia. And something opened up inside him when he did. The way his mouth struggled to form the syllables, the way the sound cracked from disuse, the way he clung to the hope shattered him. He wept afterward, not in front of anyone, not even Owen, but alone in the silence of the stairwell where no one would see her fall apart. Not because she was sad, but because it meant she had reached him deeply, undeniably. That night, as she gathered her things to leave, Sophia didn't linger. She didn't pause to contemplate the city view as she used to. She simply nodded to Carla, gave a faint smile to the security guard by the elevator, and walked out into the night with Owen's voice still echoing in her soul. Just one word, Sophia. And somewhere deep in the penthouse, Ethan sat in the dark, holding a photo, remembering a promise, and finally beginning to feel. The storage room hadn't been touched in years, not properly. Occasionally, staff would go in to pull out seasonal items or files Ethan insisted on keeping just in case, but no one ever truly sorted it with intention. Sophia made that choice that morning not out of obligation but instinct. She hadn't planned on deep cleaning it, something had simply drawn her in. Perhaps it was the photograph Ethan had begun keeping on his desk. Maybe it was the way Owen now followed her, not just with his eyes but with the slightest turns of his head. Change was blooming in the house, and Sophia, though still seen as the cleaner by many, had become something else, a silent steward of that which was slowly mending. As she moved a stack of unused boxes stamped with the label, Lillian Keep. A small drawer in the back of an antique cabinet slid open with a screech. Inside was nothing but dust and a single yellowed corner-sealed envelope flap intact, written on the front in delicate ink and unmistakably feminine handwriting. To Ethan Miller. Only if you forget how to feel. Sophia froze. Her hand hovered right above the paper and her chest tightened with something too familiar. She didn't open it. She wouldn't. But she held it for a long time before leaving the storage room, her steps heavier than when she had entered. She didn't ask anyone's permission, not out of arrogance, but certainty. This wasn't something to be processed with Ethan's aid or filed away in some inbox labeled important. This was different. She waited until the house quieted, until Owen was asleep and Carla was preparing tea in the kitchen. Ethan had returned late from a board meeting and was sitting in his office. The lights were dimmed, his eyes tracing the same page of a document he hadn't been able to finish for half an hour. Sophia appeared at the doorway, the envelope held in both hands. She didn't speak until he looked up. "I found something," she said simply. Ethan raised an eyebrow, already bracing himself for some logistical problem. But then he saw the envelope. He saw the handwriting. His face instantly changed. Time stopped between them. Where he asked, his voice, hollow. "In storage." Behind a drawer labeled, "Personal." Sophia replied. It was sealed. Ethan took the envelope with trembling fingers. For a long moment, he didn't move. When he broke the seal, his breath hitched. Sophia started to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Stay." She paused at the door, then slowly walked in as he unfolded the letter. His eyes scanned the page once, then again, then a third time, his expression crumbling with each pass. Sophia said nothing. She waited not for an explanation or permission, just for him. Ethan's voice was a whisper when he finally spoke. "She wrote this 3 days before the accident." He blinked hard, then read aloud, his voice wavering but steady enough to convey the words. "If you are reading this, it means you have forgotten how to feel or perhaps buried it too deep. Ethan, don't try to fix him. He doesn't need solutions. He needs someone to believe he is still in there. Even if he never walks again, even if he never says another word, just believe in who he was, in who he still is." His hands shook. The next part was softer. "Perhaps someone can reach him when I am gone. I hope they do. I hope you let them." Ethan didn't try to finish the rest. He folded the paper, bowed his head, and wept. It wasn't a silent cry. It was a raw, unready experience, the kind of break that only long-suppressed grief can produce. Sophia didn't comfort him with words. She simply walked closer and placed a hand on his shoulder, not as a servant, not even as a friend, but as someone who knew what it meant to carry a pain that didn't belong to them. Ethan leaned forward, covering his face with both hands. The sobs came in waves. Each one seemed to take something away. Pride, maybe. Control. But what was left seemed more human than it had in years. It wasn't that he hadn't grieved Lillian's loss, it was that he never let it undo him. And now, in the silent company of someone who asked for nothing in return, he allowed it. Finally, Sophia didn't move until his breathing calmed. When he looked at her again, eyes red and wet, he tried to speak but couldn't. She shook her head gently. "You don't have to," she said. "She wrote it for a reason." Ethan nodded slowly, as if finally grasping that not all things needed fixing. Some just needed acknowledgement. For a moment they remained silent. The letter between them now rested gently on the desk. Ethan picked it up again and read the last line, barely whispering it. "Teach him to dance even when I am gone. Sophia exhaled, her heart constricting at the very words she had once overheard Carla whisper, words that felt like a prophecy. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and something softened in his gaze. "She would have liked you," he said, the tone raw. It wasn't a line. It wasn't intended to flatter. It was a truth he didn't know he carried until now. Sophia's response came quietly and without hesitation. "I think she already does." The phrase needed no explanation. It held something timeless, an understanding that connections sometimes stretch beyond life, beyond logic, into something spiritual. Ethan nodded, tears still clinging to his lashes. He folded the letter one last time and placed it in the center of his desk where it would remain, not hidden, not stored, seen. And in that moment, no therapy, no program, no breakthrough by Owen mattered. Just the letter and the woman who had found it. Ethan had broken down in her presence for the first time, not out of failure, not out of fear, but release. Sophia stood by him, a silent witness to a moment he hadn't known he needed. She had handed him a piece of his past, and in doing so gave him a future he hadn't believed possible. And as she turned to leave, giving him space to feel, not to fix, Ethan whispered again, this time to no one in particular, "She would have liked you." Sophia paused at the door, smiled softly, and replied without turning around, "I think she already does." Sophia began to bring the ribbons in quietly. She didn't announce their purpose. She didn't draw attention to it. It was long, soft, faded, pale yellow, more cloth than decoration. Owen noticed it immediately. His eyes tracked it as she unfurled it like a small flag of peace. "This is just for us," she told him on the first day, her voice quiet, her hands soft. "No pressure. We'll let the ribbon do the work." She loosely wrapped it around his hand and hers, then moved slowly, teaching him to follow movement with movement. Not with his legs, never with force, only his arms. At first, it was next to nothing. A slight wrist flick, an inclination of the elbow. But Sophia marked every millimeter of effort as a celebration. There she would whisper, "That's it, Owen. That is dancing." He blinked slowly in response, the same rhythm he had used weeks ago to say yes. Ethan watched from the doorway more often now, never interfering, but drawn into the ritual Sophia was creating. It didn't look like therapy, it wasn't instructional. It was a kind of call and response, a language only two people understood, one patient, one awakening. Each day the movement grew. One afternoon, Sophia added a second ribbon, allowing Owen to practice extending both arms outward while she remained behind him, gently guiding. He no longer looked away when she spoke. His eyes now settled on hers, not always, but more. Sometimes he would anticipate her next move, lifting an arm, just as she reached for it, as if trying to meet her halfway. "You're not following me," she said once, smiling. "You're leading." Owen didn't smile back. Not quite. But the corners of his mouth twitched, and that was enough for her to feel the weight of the moment. Ethan, watching, began to notice something changing in himself, too. He no longer stood with his arms crossed, his shoulders weren't so tense. He no longer looked at Sophia with suspicion, but with a quiet, reverent curiosity. Once he had built empires out of strategy and timing, but nothing in his life had taught him what Sophia was teaching his son, and perhaps quietly him too, how to let go without giving up. Sophia never asked Ethan to join. She didn't need to. She knew the door to him had to open the same way it did for Owen, gently and only when he was ready. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. Sophia and Owen were practicing the same ribbon sequence as usual, music playing faintly from her small speaker. The melody was familiar now. A soft rhythm, no lyrics, just harmony. But this time something was different. When Sophia stepped slightly to the side, Owen followed, not just with his arms, but with his entire torso. Then, incredibly, his hips moved. A slight rock from left to right. His legs didn't lift, but his feet shuffled just an inch on the floor mat. Sophia froze, not out of fear, but awe. She looked at him not with disbelief, but the quiet respect of one who witnesses someone cross a personal boundary. "You're moving," she whispered. "Owen." He looked up at her, then down at his feet. The ribbon between their hands still fluttered. She didn't push. She waited. And then he did it again. The smallest shift of weight from one foot to the other, just enough to call it dancing. Not therapy, not training. Dancing. Sophia swallowed hard. It wasn't the movement that made her shake. It was the intention behind it. Owen wasn't imitating, he was participating. Ethan walked into the room halfway through. His sole intent was to check in, maybe say goodnight, but what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Owen was swaying back and forth, his face tranquil but focused. Sophia was beside him, her hands still wrapped in the ribbon, guiding without driving. The music carried them in a loop of barely steps, like shadows taking shape. Ethan didn't speak. He couldn't. His mind tried to explain it. Muscle reflexes, memory triggers a trick of the angle, but his heart knew better. This wasn't science. This wasn't something planned. This was his son. After years of dancing around silence, the door inside Ethan, the one that grief had welded shut, the one he had boarded up with work, silence, and guilt, flew open. A part of him that had been dormant slowly awoke, as if afraid it would break the moment he stepped forward and kicked off his shoes. Sophia saw him approach but didn't stop the music. She simply lifted the second end of the ribbon and held it out. He took it without a word. For the first time, Ethan Miller joined the rhythm. He stood behind his son and let the ribbon connect them, one hand on Owen's shoulder, the other gently guiding. Sophia moved to the side, marking the beat with her fingers. They didn't dance perfectly. Ethan's movements were clumsy at first, too rigid, too careful. But Owen didn't pull away. He let his father in. The rhythm was soft, circular, like a breath. Ethan followed Owen's pace, letting his body sway side to side, tracing the boy's tentative steps. His mind didn't analyze. It surrendered. For the first time since Lillian's death, he didn't think about progress or outcome. He felt the weight of his son beneath his palm. He felt the resistance and the courage in Owen's movements. And then he felt his own grief dissolve a little into something else, something quieter, warmer. It wasn't joy yet, but it was hope. And that was enough to move. Sophia now kept her distance, letting the two of them lead. Her eyes shone, but she held back her tears, giving the moment space. It belonged to them. No one spoke. The music played on. This wasn't about conversation. It was about communion. When the song ended, Ethan slowly released the ribbon, kneeling to look directly at Owen. He placed both hands on his son's knees and waited until the boy's gaze met his. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and ragged. Owen didn't speak, but he didn't have to. His eyes said everything. Sophia finally stepped forward and placed the ribbon back in Owen's lap, gently wrapping it around his fingers. She said nothing either, not because she had nothing to offer, but because what had transpired needed no words to validate it. It was real. It had lived. And for Ethan Miller, the man who had once sealed every emotion behind door systems and silence, that room, the one he had kept closed out of fear and guilt, finally opened. Not all the way, but wide enough to let in the music, his son, and the parts of himself he thought had died. Ethan waited until Owen was asleep to approach her. Sophia was folding towels in the utility room, sleeves rolled up, her face as tranquil as ever. But something in Ethan's voice as he spoke made her pause mid-fold. "I want you to stay," he said. She looked at him, unsure of what he meant. "Not just as a cleaner," he added. "Not even just as what you've become to Owen. I mean permanently as part of this." There was no practiced tone, no dramatic flourish, just a man speaking the truth without armor. Sophia stared at the floor for a long moment, then straightened and set the towel down. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. Ethan shook his head. "You don't have to answer now. I just want you to know that this..." He gestured vaguely between them. "This place feels different when you're in it. Alive. And not just for him. For me too." Sophia's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. "There's something I need to understand first," she said softly, "before I can say yes." Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She shook her head. "I don't know yet, but I will." That night, the penthouse hosted a black tie gala in the ballroom 2 floors below. An annual event his father had once turned into a spectacle, but which Ethan had scaled back in recent years to something quieter, more dignified. Sophia hadn't planned on attending. She had no reason to, and she wasn't a part of that world. But Carla insisted she take a break and go downstairs, if only for 10 minutes. "It's for the kids," she said, half joking. "You're already qualified." Sophia relented, put on a simple navy dress, and stood in the back near the catering staff content to observe from the margins. The evening was uneventful until a donor discovered a large memorial exhibit, a black and white photograph from the early 1980s, enlarged and framed, showing Ethan's father, Harold Miller, shaking hands with a thin, dark-skinned young woman with thick curls and high cheekbones. Sophia's heart stopped. She stared at the photo and her face went pale. That face, that woman, was her mother, or if not an exact likeness. She walked closer, her mouth dry, and read the small plaque underneath Harold Miller, 1983. Education Initiative, Brazil. Her mother had been there. She had spoken of those years of a man with pale blue eyes. The photo stayed with her all night, even after she excused herself from the event and returned to her floor. She didn't say anything to Carla or Ethan, but her hands shook as she folded linens again. Meanwhile, Ethan remained at the gala, shaking hands, making donations, pretending to care about wine pairings and tax deductions. When he returned hours later, Sophia was already gone for the night, but the image of her mother or someone exactly like her haunted her until the next morning. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. There were stories she had grown up with, strange silences when she asked about her father, odd comments about a man with important hands and a dangerous kindness. She hadn't made the connection before. Why would she? But now everything felt different. The pieces didn't fit. They clicked into place with an unsettling ease. She needed answers, not from Ethan, but from the house itself, from the legacy that lingered in rooms no one entered anymore. That afternoon, while Ethan was checking on Owen, Sophia quietly entered Harold Miller's study, the one Ethan never used, the one no one cleaned unless asked. She searched carefully, not chaotically. She moved books, opened drawers, scanned files. It took her almost an hour, but then she found it. A plain envelope tucked behind a row of encyclopedias, almost flush with the back wall. Her fingers went cold as she pulled it out. It was labeled in careful handwriting, "To my other daughter." A knot formed in her throat. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it, as if a part of her feared that reading the truth would change something irreversible. Inside were a single folded sheet of paper and an official document, a birth certificate. Sophia Miles, Father Harold James Grant. She stared at the name until her vision blurred. The letter was short, written in the same hand as the envelope. "If you ever find this, I hope it is the right time. I hope your mother told you enough to find your way to this house. I was not brave enough to know you. I am sorry. I hope you found what you needed without me. But if you are here, then perhaps something beautiful happened anyway." Sophia's breath caught. Her chest felt empty and full all at once. She didn't confront Ethan immediately. There was no confrontation that could happen. This wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't even a revelation. It was gravity, the slow pull of truth, finding its place. Later that night, Sophia stood at Ethan's office door. He was sitting exhausted, a half-empty glass of whiskey beside him. When he saw her, he started to rise, but she held up the envelope slightly and said, "I think you should see this." He took it carefully. The name on the front froze his hands. When he opened the letter and then the certificate, his eyes widened, then went blank. His face turned pale. "I don't understand," he whispered. "She never told me." "I didn't." His voice broke. Sophia remained silent, waiting. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with something between disbelief and sorrow. "You're my sister," he said slowly, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Sophia nodded once. Half she said, "But yes." Neither spoke for a while after that. There was no guidebook for moments like this, only breathing and presence. And so it was that the woman who had saved his son turned out to be family all along, not by choice, not by design, but by blood. A truth buried by a man who kept too many secrets and uncovered by a woman who came looking for nothing more than a job. Ethan leaned back in his chair, stunned, and said nothing for a long moment. Sophia didn't press. She didn't need him to understand it all now. She just needed him to feel it, and he did deeply. When he finally found the words, they were quiet, filled with awe and regret. "You have my father's eyes?" Sophia let out a sigh that seemed to have waited years to escape. "I always wondered where they came from," she said softly. And for the first time since she had arrived, neither of them felt like a stranger in that house. The truth had changed everything, but in the end, it had only revealed what was already there. Ethan waited until the next morning to speak. He hadn't slept. The envelope lay on his desk like an immovable weight. When Sophia walked into the room to begin her routine, he wouldn't let her take another step. "Sophia," he said, his voice raw, almost unrecognizable to her. She stopped mid-movement, her eyes meeting his with a kind of knowing. Something had shifted in the air, not tension but something heavier. "I need to tell you something," he said. She nodded but didn't walk closer. "I found another letter," he continued, "from my father addressed to his other daughter." The words came out slower than he intended, as if speaking them would cement a truth he didn't fully grasp yet. Sophia didn't blink. She didn't flinch. He held out the letter, but she didn't take it. She didn't need to. She already knew. "It's you," he said, his voice almost breaking. "You're my sister." For a moment, everything was silent. Sophia exhaled, clenching her hands slightly at her sides. "I was just a cleaner," she whispered. "I didn't mean to clean out your history." The line landed like a punch. Neither of them knew how to deflect the blow. She turned and left without another word. Ethan didn't follow. He couldn't. He watched her walk out of the room, out of the penthouse, out of the life they had just begun to build. For the next few days, the apartment felt empty again. Not lifeless like before, just quieter in a way that echoed. Owen regressed, not dramatically, but noticeably. His movement slowed. His humming stopped. He didn't blink twice when asked a question. Carla said it might be temporary, but Ethan knew. It wasn't Owen who changed. It was the room. The rhythm had been broken. Ethan tried to keep the routines going, sat with his son, played the same songs, offered the ribbon. But everything felt mechanical, empty. The moments that once buzzed with invisible connection were now silent and detached. He considered calling Sophia more than once. He picked up his phone, typed her name into a message, and then deleted it. What could he say? How do you ask someone back into your life after telling them the only reason they were there was a family secret neither of you chose? On the fourth day, Ethan sat beside Owen as the boy stared out the window in silence. There was a weight in the air no therapist or medication could lift. He reached for the ribbon again but didn't pick it up. "I don't know what to do," he confessed out loud. "I don't know how to do this without her." Owen didn't reply. Of course he didn't, but Ethan still spoke as if trying to keep something alive in the space between them. "She didn't just help you. She helped me. And now she's gone and I..." He trailed off. There was no point in finishing. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Ethan walked into the room, prepared for another challenging day, but then he froze. Sophia was already there quietly, as if she had never left. She was kneeling beside Owen, her hands gently wrapping his. She didn't look at Ethan. She didn't speak at first, but the silence wasn't cold. It was full of meaning. She took Owen's left hand, then held her other hand out to Ethan. He moved slowly, cautiously, afraid this might be a dream that would dissolve with movement. But when he reached for her, she didn't flinch. She placed his hand in Owen's right and held both of theirs in hers, anchoring them together. Finally, she spoke. "Let's start again," she whispered. Her voice wasn't unsure. It was firm, full of quiet determination. Not from scratch. From here. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, anchored in her words. From here. The past had already shaped them. The lies, the discoveries, the pain. None of that could be undone, but something could still grow from it. A new beginning built not on blood or guilt, but on choice. Sophia stood and switched on the speaker. The same melody from before began to play. She gave no instruction. She simply let the music breathe, and slowly the three of them, Owen in his chair, Sophia to his left, Ethan to his right, began to move their arms interwoven. Three people never meant to find each other this way, and yet they did. They swayed soft rhythmically, as if following an invisible pattern that only made sense in the moment. Ethan let his stocking feet shuffle on the floor as he moved alongside Owen. Sophia guided without controlling, as she had always done. The ribbon lay forgotten on the table. It was no longer needed. The connection wasn't symbolic anymore. It was alive, embodied, shared. Ethan looked at his son, who had begun to hum again, a faint sonic vibration that Sophia matched with a soft echo of her own. Ethan joined not with words but with his breath. One rhythm layered over another. There was no performance, no goal, only presence. Sophia finally looked at Ethan, her expression unreadable but open, and he spoke the truth he now knew. "You didn't find us by accident," he whispered. "You were always part of the music." She didn't cry, not in that moment, but her grip on both of them tightened slightly. The smallest confirmation that yes, she heard it too. This wasn't the music of coincidence or duty. It was the music of healing woven slowly through grief loss and an improbable family. And as they danced, clumsy and imperfect but real, the music wasn't just something they moved to. It was something they had become. Months passed, though it felt like a different lifetime. The penthouse, once sterile and silent, now pulsed with signs of life. Music played freely throughout the day, sometimes soft classical pieces, other times bolder Latin rhythms. Sophia had taught Owen to hum along. Ethan no longer walked in silence. Laughter echoed through the halls, not always Owen's, but from the people who now frequented the space: therapists, volunteers, children visiting with curious eyes and careful steps. The penthouse was no longer just a home. It had become a place for living, and at its heart sat an idea born not of ambition but of healing: the Stillness Center. Ethan and Sophia co-founded it, a program for disabled children, those who struggled not just to speak, but to connect, to be seen. The goal wasn't speech. It was expression, movement, feeling, connection. What had worked for Owen, what had transformed their lives, was now being offered to others. And they had done it together, not as CEO and cleaner, not even as half-siblings, but as two people who had learned to build from the pain instead of hiding behind it. On the opening day, the penthouse had been carefully rearranged. The grand hallway, once a cold artery of silence, was cleared to serve as a stage. Folding chairs lined both sides, filled with parents, doctors, former skeptics, and wide-eyed children. The hall floor, waxed and slick, gleamed like something sacred. Ethan wore a simple shirt with rolled-up sleeves, nervous as a man about to speak his first truth. Sophia stood beside him in flats and a simple sheath dress, her hands never far from Owen, who sat in his chair, watching it all with quiet intensity. Carla stood to the side, her eyes brimming with pride, and the air vibrated with anticipation. "You don't have to do anything," Sophia told Owen softly, leaning in to meet his eyes. "You already did." Ethan knelt beside her. "But if you want to, we're right here." Owen didn't speak. He didn't need to. He placed his hand on the walker brace in front of him, the same one he had practiced with for weeks. He gripped it, paused, and then slowly, deliberately, he stood. The room went completely silent. His first step was careful, more a shift than a stride. The second, surer. On the third, the room held its breath. And then, reaching his marked spot, he stopped, straightened, and bowed. No awkwardness, no forcing it, gracefully, knowingly. The applause was instant, loud, full-throated, unrestrained. Sophia brought her hand to her mouth. Ethan couldn't move. He stared, paralyzed, watching his son stand in the place he thought he would never be again. And then, without being prompted, Owen leaned to the side and picked up the yellow ribbon, the same one Sophia had wound between them on those quiet afternoons. He held it up for a second, letting it unfurl like a banner. And then, his feet planted but his torso fully engaged, he twirled once a full, slow circle. It wasn't fast. It wasn't smooth. But it was everything. The movement was proud, resolute, celebratory. The crowd erupted again, louder this time. People stood cheering. Some wept. Some didn't know how to process what they were witnessing, but they knew it mattered. Ethan stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Owen's shoulder, tears in his eyes. Sophia remained beside them, wordless, but her whole body shaking with the weight of the moment. Ethan turned to her, his voice low but clear, spoken only for her to hear. "He's your son too," he said, not a statement or a metaphor, but a truth forged in movement, patience, and love. Sophia didn't reply immediately. She didn't have to. Her eyes shone, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. She nodded once, slowly. Her hand found Ethan's, and for a brief instant, they formed a complete circle. Sophia, Ethan, and Owen. No longer divided by guilt, blood, or the past, just the present. Together. Around them the cheering continued, but within that noise something more subtle was taking place, a shared silence, one that no longer meant emptiness, but completion. The music swelled again, this time with a beat faster, fuller. It wasn't background noise or ambiance. It was an invitation. Several children began clapping along. A small girl tapped her foot on the floor. A boy in a chair with braces raised both arms and mimicked Owen's twirl. It spread like a wave. Each movement responded to another. Parents followed, tentative at first, then fully present. A spontaneous dance had begun, unpolished, unrehearsed, but real. The hallway, once a corridor of grief, had become a space of pure joy. Ethan looked around, stunned. The penthouse no longer belonged to memory. It belonged to life. Sophia met his gaze, and without words, they began to walk together, their movements slow and synchronized, echoing the dance that had begun between her and Owen. And in that moment, among ribbons, applause, and shuffles that became sacred, the silence, once a prison, became a dance floor. We poured our heart into this story. Every scene was carefully crafted to touch the soul and honor the quiet power of human connection. If this journey moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue sharing stories like this story's made for you. We'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Which part of this story impacted you the most, and if you haven't already, explore our other videos. Perhaps you'll find another story that touches your heart. From all of us, thank you for being with us. Would you like me to translate any other stories, or perhaps draft a social media caption for the Stillness Center?